Hello and welcome to the Cluster API working group for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Today is Wednesday, August 22nd, 2018. Let's see, Jason, are you here? I put your thing at the very top, number 463.
Yes, I am. We had a issue come in asking to be able to not pivot the cluster, and there were some discussions. Some people felt that we shouldn't pivot the cluster by default. And this PR is basically my attempt at doing it for the internal POC that we were doing a little while back. I know you had some questions, Robert, about the implementation versus an alternative proposal. So I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, I'm just pulling it up to see. So I guess what I was looking at is right now in the open source, when you run cluster cuddle, it creates minikube and then pivots from there into the cluster that gets created. Mm-hmm. And if we switch the default behavior, I guess it feels like what's going to happen is it's going to create minikube and just use that as the cluster and not pivot out of it. Is that right?
For the cluster API kind of bootstrapping cluster, yes, wouldn't actually pivot the cluster API into the created cluster. The more general workflow would be for tying into like an external bootstrapping cluster where you would have multiple cluster definitions and you wouldn't want to perform that pivot.
Right. So I guess my question was in terms of like the user scenario, it feels like the default user scenario that we want sort of people to get started with would be to pivot so that you're not like you accidentally close your laptop or delete minikube and lose your control plane. And that sort of maybe the more advanced scenario would be you don't pivot. So once you have that first one up, maybe use that as the bootstrapper for your second one or something. I guess so when you like it switches the default in addition to setting this new behavior. I feel like the new behavior makes a lot of sense, but maybe switching the default doesn't make as much sense because the getting started scenario is going to be confusing to people.
Yep. I can see that. I can switch that up to remove the switching of the default.
I mean, does anyone else have any thoughts about that?
So is this targeted more towards developers than administrators? Because I mean, if you're using minikube, it's going to run on your laptop or desktop.
In this case, it's more targeted for users of the cluster cuddle command.
Okay. I think for us that probably wouldn't work for user of vSphere, but yeah, I could see how it could be useful.
Which part do you think wouldn't work?
Well, I mean, most of our customers are administrators, so we look at things from an administrator perspective. The admin is going to most likely going to be they want to be able to create these clusters, or if they give a user the ability to do it, it has to be a central resource, right? And the administrators are going to want to know what is being created on their infrastructure. So having that single source of truth somewhere is very important for them. So if you got minikube as the primary API server that knows about all the cluster on your laptop or something, that I'm not sure that admins are going to like that.
So Cluster Cuddle already allows you to use an external bootstrap server through a command line argument. Minikube is just the default for having something available to be able to provision a cluster. And I think that's even only that was just the initial design. That's not necessarily the eventual design.
No, I completely agree that, I brought up a similar issue last week where we don't actually particularly like the bootstrap using Minikube as a bootstrap mechanism either. So,
does it make sense to not pivot if you're not using an external bootstrap server? I mean, certainly, I don't know. If you're running Minikube, I think you probably want to pivot unless you're a developer. And I view cluster control as being a user-facing tool, not strictly for developers. We've actually had discussions internally about maybe changing the interface for cluster control. It's outside of the scope of this, but briefly I'll mention that the one thing that cluster control does now that we depend on, but we can't use all the time, is the fact that it deploys the API server. So we can only have one API server per cluster. And so it might make sense to break up the cluster control process into like a cluster control init to install the API server where you want it, and then a cluster control deploy or create cluster, right, to do the second half of it.
Yeah, I think the first thing you said there is really interesting, which is if you're using Minikube, then you probably want to pivot by default, which is kind of what I was bringing up at the beginning. But if you aren't using Minikube, then maybe you don't want to pivot by default. I don't know if that becomes sort of too confusing for customers, but it really makes sense, because if you're pointing at an existing bootstrapping cluster, then presumably you kind of want to leave things there. And I think that's what Jason was saying with his PR was, like, you point it over here and you don't want to move it out of there. And what I guess my retort is, if you're using Minikube, you do want to kick it out. And so maybe really that's the distinction, is if you use Minikube, you pivot, and if you don't use Minikube, you don't. And then you can override the behavior to be the reverse if you need to.
I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that sounds good, especially if this is a customer-facing tool or non-developer-facing tool. I think the important part about this PR is the flag that lets us switch the behavior.
So I'll go ahead and I'll update it and switch it to switch it so that it still pivots by default for the default use case. And if the external cluster is specified, don't pivot by default, and I'll add some additional doc updates to the flags to make sure that that's clear, and then maybe still expose a flag to handle the behavior, let the user override the behavior as well.
Cool, thanks. All right, so next, I put a link in here to 409, which is about switching back to CRDs. I was doing a little bit of issue culling, and this one popped up. I was looking through, and it looks like pretty much everybody who's commented on the issue has been in favor of switching back to CRDs as opposed to staying with aggregate APIs. I think when we switched from CRDs to aggregate APIs, we had some good reasons to do so. CRDs have since made some pretty big strides in sort of catching up in terms of feature parity with aggregate APIs. And it also feels like the momentum is behind CRDs. The tools for CRDs are being actively developed and progressing, and the tools for managing aggregate API servers seem to be much more stagnant. So I guess since there weren't any dissenting opinions in the issue, I wanted to bring it up here and see if maybe there were some dissenting opinions on the line, or if people had good reasons they thought we should stay with aggregate API servers. And then if there aren't, if everybody agrees we should move back, sort of put out sort of a call for help and see if anybody wants to pick up the mantle and try to drive that work. So we'll start with the first one, which is, does anybody have strong reasons they'd want to stay with the aggregate API server model?
The only technical thing that I think I've put this up before, right? The ability to aggregate and see resources in multiple clusters, right? So in other words, you can have your I guess your machine deployment could be in a Kubernetes API server, which you could address directly, or you could then embed that Kubernetes API server in your real target cluster, right? So it could be, it was just about like figuring out whether that's useful for bootstrapping. But if someone is able to get the same sort of functionality working with CRDs, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing about that is I'm not sure if we need that right away. And I think that the path with CRDs is also to give us sort of a API server in a box with all the default resources turned off. So if we wanted to still have the similar sort of separation of failure domains between the API server for your pods and deployments and the API server machines, you could still deploy to API servers in an aggregated fashion and just install your CRDs on the extension one. So I think from an architectural point of view, you can still get that with CRDs. You don't actually have to build your own API server. And that might not quite work today, but they're certainly moving in the direction that will work, probably before we need it. Sorry, I think I interrupted someone who else was trying to jump in.
No, that makes sense.
Okay, and then Jason said in chat he started a rough attempt using Cube Builder. Do you want to say any more about your experience trying to use Cube Builder?
So far, I haven't gotten really that far with it. I've basically mocked out the actual API objects, generated the controllers. Well, I haven't even gotten to a full controller implementation yet. But the Cube Builder experience seems pretty easy. I started as like a from scratch project to avoid trying to retrofit Cube Builder in place because of the dependency issues. So I was going to try to replicate the APIs, replicate the controller behavior, and then try to retrofit it back with the dependency changes to see what happened. I'm not spending a whole lot of time on this, but I'm happy to collaborate with other people that are willing to chip in to try to make this work as well.
I had a question with regards to time frame for some of this stuff. Do folks want to do this before alpha, or did they want to wait till after alpha?
So this is on the alpha milestone list, and I think the question that Daniel brought up when creating the issue was, right now the API server builder we're using is tied to Kubernetes 1.9, which is now getting kind of old, and we'd like to be able to update to at least 1.10 or switch to CRDs, so we're not as tightly tied to a Kubernetes version. And I think one of those two things before alpha makes a lot of sense, because by the time we release alpha, like if 1.12 is being cut, then we're like at the very tail end of what might be considered a support window for that Kubernetes control plane version. So, and that was the other reason I was bringing it back up, is because it looked like this is something we kind of want to do sooner rather than later if we're going to switch. And it sounds like most people are interested in switching.
I actually did an experiment as well where I ran the existing controllers without an aggregate API server. So just like creating a CRD with no schema, and it basically, I got it to work. There's a lot of like places where we do defaulting, but the clients don't really care whether it's a CRD or not. So that was sort of the surprising. So it sort of seems to be workable.
And we should be able to get some defaulting with CRDs, right?
Yes, I just didn't, I hadn't defined any schema stuff. So, and certainly it's coming.
Yeah, I think defaulting right now is handled through the mutating webhooks only. And some of the validation that we're currently doing would have to be done through validating webhooks. But I haven't gotten that far with my experimentation yet.
Okay, so I think I'm also seeing people in chat voting for CRDs. So Jason, if you want to keep pushing us in your free time, that'd be great. And if other people are interested in sort of helping push the project over, it sounds like there's support for moving in that direction. We just need to put some people behind it to actually get there. All right, next on the agenda is making timeouts more configurable.
Yeah, this is a really simple question. I was kind of curious why these timeouts were fixed. I just assumed that was just something that you guys started out by default and never got around to making them configurable. So when during my usage and debugging through a couple of issues, I've noticed that the cluster control can basically spin forever. It'll just loop forever And some of that is based on it was either spin for the duration of the timeouts, or at least in one bug I found, it will just spin forever. Yeah, that's is a very simple question.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the timeouts, it was we said something that worked most of the time, and when we started hitting timeouts, we just bumped them up instead of plumbing flags and stuff through. So if you are seeing it not work in your environment with the current settings, we can talk about making them configurable. Are you saying you want to make them smaller because things will fail faster? Or are you saying
yeah, for this is more for development productivity. It just but then again, I can just modify the numbers in my environment and just build it and then use it that way. But it would be kind of nice. But yeah, maybe it's just would be too many options. I just want to get people's opinion on it. That's all.
Yeah, I think we should be a little bit careful about having flag sprawl. I know that's come up in the kubeadmin discussions about not creating too many flags and making the user experience difficult. But I definitely
it doesn't have to be flags. It could be other approaches.
Sure, right. You could do it with environment variables or something else that it reads, and unless you're a developer, you don't even know that they're there or know how to set them, right?
Yeah, this issue is so small that maybe we just move on. I can just modify the constants myself.
Okay. I mean, the overall issue is if we think that the timeouts are dependent upon the environment, like we might want to switch them for GCP versus AWS or something to give a better user experience, then I think that's something we should think about how we could plumb through. I don't know that we want to put it on the end user to be setting those timeouts, but I understand the use case for developers wanting to be able to tweak them. And it sucks to have to maintain, like, here's my Git branch where I've changed the timeouts that work for me, and I have to keep, rebasing that. Like, that's no fun either.
Yeah, and again, I'll bring up the fact that, I'm trying to represent the administrator in this perspective. If he sees something running, a developer, he'll go in and modify the code. But an administrator, he won't do that. And if he sees this running forever, that leaves a bad user experience.
So wait, is the problem that things are not timing out when they should, or as fast as you'd like?
Well, it's both. I've seen there are a couple bugs in there, but in general, it's more about the timeouts being too long.
Okay. All right. If it's too long, fair enough.
And this may be just an issue with the provider for vSphere, because there's not enough error feedback, so you don't know what it exactly is doing. All you're seeing it's doing is it's just looping basically for forever.
Yeah, I think it's like 30 minutes or something, which definitely.
Yeah. And in the case of that loop, it actually loops forever because there's a bug in the code. Yeah, it's for a developer, I know what to do. For administrator, they're not going to go in and modify the code or look at the code.
So my preference is not to expose options that are rarely used. I think this is a relatively esoteric thing. I agree that right now it takes too long to time out. But there's another issue related to making parts of cluster control pluggable. And I wonder if maybe we just need to get the timeouts right for each implementation. I don't know.
Maybe this goes into the provider config sections of one of the YAMLs. I don't know what the solution is, but I just wanted to bring up this issue that from a developer perspective, it's I see no problem, but from an administrator perspective, I think it's gonna be a bad user experience for them, and they might end up not using it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think as you drive the sort of making the, like as they were saying, making the deployment more pluggable, this might be a good sort of subtask of that. Of if you have different ways to create the bootstrap cluster, those presumably might need different timeouts, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so all right. In the interest of time, I think we should move on to the next one, which is I linked a PR and assigned hard cut for this. Because I think it's ready to merge, but I just wanted to bring it up here because it is an API change. It's number 483, which we talked about last week, and there was general agreement on. The PR has been only open for a day, so I don't know if people have had enough time to look at it. But it is to basically copy node conditions, or this just sets them in the API. There'll need to be a follow-up to actually do the copying for each of the machine implementations, but to put node conditions into the machine status. So again, I stuck a hold on the PR when I was looking at it yesterday, just to bring it up during the meeting today and make sure there weren't any dissenting opinions before we update the API. So I guess we should probably just keep moving on, so we don't just have silence while people look at it. But feel free to comment on the PR or in chat. And if there aren't any dissenting opinions by, say, tomorrow, then we'll remove the hold and go ahead and merge that. Okay, next is Marco. So it's talking about DigitalOcean provider.
Yes. I have a question. What are steps and how is it going on if someone wants to push the cluster API provider upstream, and how that works overall? For now, I'm working on DigitalOcean provider, and I'm interested, is it possible to push it upstream? Is someone interested in that? And yes, how that works.
Are you talking with Andrew, Marco? Sycam?
Yes.
So he's really been driving the process for introducing new upstream cloud providers. So we've been working on that in SIG Cloud Provider, trying to put down requirements that, I mean, to be fair, it's a little, I mean, there's certainly, I guess, some implicit bias towards providers that are already in tree. What we're really trying to do with the, like, moving external providers into some CNCF managed repository is to really improve the state, like a technical bar for cloud providers. So improving the documentation. So Nishi from AWS had a cap out for doing that, for setting new requirements for documentation for both in tree and out of tree. There's membership requirements now for people who want to sponsor a sub-project under cloud provider, but that's really the place where we're trying to work on this under SIG Cloud Provider, because they have the the ultimate authority to be creating these repositories.
So there's a little bit of a difference, I think, Caleb, because we're talking about the cluster API provider for DigitalOcean, not the cloud provider implementation. And so that the other ones of those are mostly sponsored by this SIG and not by the cloud provider SIG, with the exception of the VMware one, which I believe is currently sponsored by SIG VMware. And like the AWS one, I think it's if you look at the owner's file, it's sort of co-owned by Cluster Lifecycle and SIG AWS, and same with the GCP one. So I think one interesting thing I noticed about DigitalOcean is there isn't a SIG DigitalOcean, nor is there the cloud provider implementation. So this would maybe be the first case where we would be considering creating the cluster API provider for an environment before the other pieces were in place. So I think that is related, right? It's sort of part of the process. But depending on our SIG's feelings, we could say we're able to take this sort of ahead of the other stuff happening too.
Okay, so I have talked to Andrew from DigitalOcean, and he's okay to come join the project, to maintain it along with me, and if needed, to try to get someone else from DigitalOcean to join. As far as we know, there's nobody from DigitalOcean working on the cluster API provider. Yes, they have cloud provider for DigitalOcean. They're working on that, but there is not known that they're working on the cluster API provider. Now, I believe there is someone from my company, from Roots, interested to join on the project to maintain it. So the question here is it possible without SIG? How many owners we need there? And about membership, I guess, do all needs to be member of Kubernetes organization, or how that works? I have not got that part.
That particular bit is typically adhered to be a member of the Kubernetes org in order for the permissions model for the organizational structure to be all seen. I don't know, you could open up an issue against the Kubernetes/org directory if you wanted to have your ACLs and permissions to only be applicable to the Kubernetes SIGs subrepository. So the way the repository edition would work is we could put an example reference like Jason's email, or I forgot the VMware had submitted an email too as well, that shows all the details of what you should do beforehand. As long as the owner's file has been well vetted and those folks that are in the owner's file are part of either the Kubernetes SIGs org or the Kubernetes org, you should be okay. And as long as maintainership is a broad enough spectrum of folks that we know it's not just going to bit rot, that's usually the requirement.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any requirements from the implementation itself about anything to pay attention on when implementing actuators and that stuff? Any requirements from that side if you decide to push it upstream?
There isn't anything currently. I mean, I think the people that are building the machine actuators and the cluster controllers are mostly sort of in this meeting or in the implementer office hours meetings, and trying to sort of build consistent implementations through those meetings. I do expect us to, as we start having multiple sort of functional implementations, to start talking about some sort of conformance program or some sort of test suite that validates that they all work about the same way and give the same sort of user experience, right? But that doesn't exist yet, and a lot of the implementations a lot of the repositories that are there today are sort of just getting started and don't have necessarily fully functional implementations yet.
Okay.
Does that answer enough of your questions that it unblocks you from making sort of the next steps?
Not at all. I think that's it for now.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
One question related to that should we try and see if we could converge on kind of a shared set of requirements across the external cloud providers and the cluster API actuators? Like, I guess there's less need for the cleanup of like the existing APIs since it's new. But with the creation of new repositories, I guess if you're creating them in Kubernetes 6, maybe it doesn't matter. But I know with the cloud providers, a lot of them had wanted to be in the main Kubernetes org, in the core org. So there's maybe a higher bar there, just naturally.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that maybe is implicit in what Tim was saying with the owner's files is if we do start to see the owner's files bit rot, I think that as a SIG, we're going to be somewhat aggressive in either trying to find replacement owners or kicking things out because our SIG doesn't want to claim or try to maintain ownership of things if people aren't actively contributing and being sort of that owner role. And if you look at the SIG charter pull request that Tim's got out, the SIG does sort of delegate sort of the full ownership of these sub projects to the people in those owners files, from cutting releases, doing issue tracking, making sure PRs merge. And I think that we're going to need to sort of hold those people up to a reasonably high bar to make sure that as a SIG, we have sort of a useful community.
Cool. Yeah, you might want to take a look at the requirements we've had for the sub projects in a cloud provider, because we're trying to address those same kind of concerns. And I'll drop a link to the PR in the notes.
All right, thanks. All right, Jason, 484.
Yes, this is just a follow-up from last week where we had a discussion around the external, internal naming within Cluster Cuddle was very confusing for people. So I was just looking to gather some feedback on the PR that I put out there, and I saw you already added a few comments there, Robert, that I just haven't had a chance to address yet.
Yeah, I think overall it looks great. There were a couple of nits, tiny little things, but I think the main one was at one point you said, creating external or creating Bootstrap cluster, and the other was creating Bootstrap client. I think maybe when you said client, you were trying to get at the sense that sometimes we actually create a cluster and sometimes we use an existing cluster. But I also think that's maybe confusing for users.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, and I think it makes more sense to stick with cluster in that sense.
So other than that, I think people were pretty much on board with the naming change. So I think we should, if anybody else wants to take a look at the PR, please do so. And otherwise, we'll try to get this one merged in the next day or so.
Thank you.
Okay, so next, David, transfer of ownership of your skeleton repo to Kubernetes SIGs.
Right. So there's been at least 3 implementations based on this now. I wanted to update it a little bit more. There's 2 requirements for providers that aren't well documented and don't have simple canonical implementations yet. So those 2 problems are the provider deployer interface with get IP and get config, and then also the annotation that is required for cluster control. So those deficiencies aside, I wanted to see if there was interest in moving this to SIG cluster lifecycle so that I'm not the only one with commit privileges and ownership of it. And I'm familiar with the process. I think if there were no objections, we would have to do a lazy consensus vote and then send a request to create a new repo after meeting some requirements.
Tim, what do you think? I mean, I'm a little bit torn because on the one hand, I would expect that the rate of creating new providers to sort of drop off. And maybe by the time we kind of clean this up and get it moved over, we don't necessarily need it anymore. Because I think it has served a great purpose for like the ones we've created so far. I also kind of wonder if we move over to CRDs, if we need sort of less of the template and less boilerplate. And also with the push towards the gRPC/webhooks for actuators, that also sort of reduces the amount of boilerplate and templating that we need because we're reducing the surface area you need to actually create an environment. What do you guys think?
I personally like the idea of having some type of a reference for implementers. And I think even if we scale it down, this skeleton repo could potentially be a home for documentation that we eventually add as well for what it takes to create a provider, as well as having kind of a skeleton to start from. There seem to be a few different cases where this is kind of common within the community already, especially around like API server examples and things like that. It seems useful to me.
I think we can hold for the time being because the problem with apparatus, I mean, I think it's useful as long as we get it trimmed down to the state space that we want to maintain it. And I'm wondering if we do the 2 parts that you had mentioned earlier, both the webhook for defaulting as well as the CRD changes, whether or not we can actually crib an examples implementation directly into the cluster API repository, much like many other main applications do. They just have an examples folder. This is what you need to do to implement your own version. And it has a skeleton subsection. And if it's trimmed down enough, it's possible to maintain it within that repository. And then it's part of the core of cluster API itself.
Yeah, I mean, having one less repository to groom PRs and issues and get notifications from, to me, sounds really nice. And I would be awesome if we could stick it in the main repo because I'm already looking at that one. I think right now the way that like we use the API server builder and so forth, that doesn't really work. But yeah, like maybe if we clean up a bit of that stuff, then we could just, like Tim said, have an examples directory in there and stick all the stuff you need in that repo. That would be a great solution. Okay, so I think I'm seeing a thumbs up there from David. So I think we'll go with Tim's proposal, which is sort of to put this on ice as we try to work through a couple of the other things and see if it's still necessary once those are finished. Okay, Hardik, machine classes.
Yes, so I was thinking maybe we can reinitiate the discussion that we used to have some time back on the machine class. So that we, I guess we had pretty much consensus long back when we were on CRDs, but then we moved to a different repository and it somehow got buried out. So the motivation was coming from a couple of directions. So first of all, at the moment, for the reusability of the row extension that we are putting in the provider config. So if we want to reuse across different machine sets and machine deployments, that could be one of the nice use case. Plus, one strong use case is directly coming from the cluster autoscaler, where at some point autoscaler will also expect that right now, as they are relying on the node objects, they would want to get certain details like node allocatables and the resources of the machines and so on, be rather stored at a static layer, which could be machine class, and then they could go to nodes equal to 0, such kind of problems can then be resolved. So I was just wondering, there is already a comment I have putting up my thoughts there. So just wondering if we can reinitiate the discussion there, and we can have one work in progress. It looks like it will be quite a good change. I mean, not inside, but it will be a significant change from outside. So maybe I can already create a work in progress PR. We can discuss more on that and decide if it makes sense to get ahead.
Yeah, so I had the initial PR for this in the main repo, and there were some comments, and then we switched from kubedeploy to cluster API. And I started trying to recreate that PR and ran into some issues with the code gen, because the machine class, as I defined it before, doesn't have a spec and a status. It's more like storage classes where it's just sort of a data blob. And the API generation stuff with the API server builder doesn't like that. Like, it tries to auto-generate spec and status stubs, which you then have to go delete from the generated code, which is kind of a pain. So I haven't checked out KubeBuilder. I don't know if it also makes the assumption that everything has a spec and a status and will have the same problem with its code generation. But that was sort of one thing that I ran into, which was kind of unfortunate. And then I didn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe we can maybe figure out. I can look into that if there is a good way to avoid the spec and have a direct row extension under provider config.
I think that maybe your meta question is, assuming somebody starts working on this, are there any objections to this path forward?
Yes.
And I'm hoping the answer is no, because I think we already came to the consensus in this group that we wanted to have this feature as part of the API. So I don't see anybody speaking up or shaking their head or -1ing in chat. So I think there's still time for people to object if they think this design doesn't make sense. But I think we should start pushing forward, trying to revivify that PR. So maybe Hardik, you and I can sort of chat offline, and I can point you to where my code is right now, because I can just push it to my fork, and you can take a look at that and see if you have any brilliant ideas of how to deal with the code gen. And maybe we should also sync with Jason, because it's possible that KubeBuilder with CRDs solves the problem, and we should just push on that effort first and then not have to deal with the code gen wrinkles of the API server builder.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, then. Sounds good.
Cool.
For what it's worth, I think KubeBuilder suffers from the same issue right now as well.
Bummer. I was hoping that would just magically solve our problems. All right, Ilya, you're next.
Yeah, so we had 2 meetings on Monday so far, the implementers office hours, and yeah, basically I volunteered as chair, but I don't know who originally proposed it, because that person's definitely not showed up to either of the 2 meetings we had, and I was wondering, who suggested this meeting, and yeah, because I mean the attendance bit kind of low. Well, just a couple of people, myself and Lubomir Justin joined last time, but I was just wondering, whether there was a particular person who who was intending to join that meeting regularly, or it was suggested as a, just as a time slot that would satisfy, that would work for anybody in like UK time zone or something like that.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing Daniel on the line today. So I think what happened is he sent out a poll to figure out when people could meet. And there were sort of two groupings of people, one that looked like they could meet at the time slot he's running on Tuesdays, and one that looked like they could meet at this time slot on Mondays. And he volunteered to run the Tuesday one and has been doing that. And basically he couldn't do the Monday one that, in addition to, or maybe the time didn't work for him, but it felt like there was a group of people that when they responded based on availability, that time worked for them and the other time didn't. So it's possible that those people said that time worked, but maybe aren't interested in actually showing up. Or those people don't realize that there's a meeting at a time that actually works.
Yeah, so that's basically what I'm wondering. So, okay, well, perhaps I should dig up that poll. Is it on the mailing list?
There was an email sent out to the mailing list. I don't know how long like the data for those things floats around, right? Because we're using the external site that you kind of click in what times are available. So yeah, if you dig it up and see if that's still there, that would be useful. Because everybody does sort of put their name in with the times they're available. And so you can probably see the cluster of people and maybe reach out to them and see if they're still interested. Yeah,
cool. Okay. And the other issue of that meeting is that actually it overlaps with the AWS implementers meeting. Or what do you call that one? The AWS one is also on Monday, and there's an overlap with the office hours one by half an hour. And personally, I'd like to join both.
Well, and that could be another issue with attendance. If other people also want to join both, maybe they're choosing to join the other one instead. Right.
Yeah.
Because that's maybe a more specific meeting they think will be more useful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, I'll think about that. Try to reach out to try to dig up who wanted to have that meeting on Mondays, and yeah. Cool. Okay.
Right. Tim, you are next.
I just wanted to have a PSA. We are trying to switch the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting to be more generic to apply to all of the folks under the large umbrella. And one of the topics that I think I want to bring up and discuss as we start to have this set of federated repositories is unification of process for triaging issues that are inbound. We have a well-defined process that we've used for the Kubernetes repository, and those who have come up the ranks have done a good job in helping to distill this down, and it helps a lot for keeping things up to date and managing things. So I think during the next SIG cluster lifecycle meeting, which could potentially be in 2 weeks, I hope, we should be able to have a conversation there, and it might be worthwhile for folks who are maintainers of other repos to potentially go to that meeting. That's it.
Isn't that meeting every week?
It's currently every week, but I'm part of the meeting this week was to discuss about having it bi-weekly, just because we want to kind of call the conversation topics to be meta topics across the entire SIG, and just be germane to that space, and then have the independent office hours be specific for the sub-projects.
Okay.
Since we're not sure if there's going to be a meeting next week or not, can we just say we'll discuss this on September 4th?
Sure.
Okay. Regardless of whether there's a meeting next Tuesday.
Was there a vote on when the biweekly would start?
No, I need to still send out the email. That needs to happen today.
Just me personally, I would prefer it to start next week because I couldn't make it to this week's meeting because I have another internal meeting that I must go to at that time. So it's just one request. But if you guys can't accommodate it, then I'll just watch the video.
I guess that's a good point. If we're going to do a bi-weekly cadence, we should figure out if there's a phase that works better for the majority of people. Right? I think that's what Logan's pointing out, is that one phase works for him and the other doesn't, and that might be true for other folks as well. Both work for me and probably for you, Tim, since we've been going to those meetings for a while. And dropping one is great, but for people who maybe haven't been able to attend, picking which week we start on actually might make a difference. I had not thought about that.
For what it's worth, Lubomir has been doing a bang up job, and he also works for VMware, so you can always poke him too as well with regards to the inbound triaging of repositories.
Yeah, look, something about the topic of like splitting the meeting. I mean, not splitting the meeting, but making it bi-weekly. So Cluster API has a lot of separate meetings related to cloud providers. And while we have a bunch of problems in kubeadm, so we already have 1 hour per week for kubeadm. So maybe we should consider like doing something about that. But that's another topic. It's a separate SIG discussion.
Okay. I guess we can't necessarily say it'll be September 4th if we start the phasing opposite, but I guess the meta point is try to watch the recording or attend a very soon upcoming SIG Lifecycle meeting where we can sort of evangelize the existing kubeadmin issue triage process and try to make that consistent across the other repos, which is especially pertinent for people in this group because there are a lot of people in this group that are starting to manage some of the provider implementation repos. And we're going to want to try to follow a consistent process on those. It's maybe more pertinent than some of the other, like all the people working on kubeadmin has already been doing this and they have a single place to do it. And we're going to have multiple places to do it because we've forked into multiple repos. So thank you, Tim, for the PSA. And with that, we've reached the end of the agenda. We have about 10 minutes left if somebody wants to throw something else on.
Yeah, this is more of a question for myself. I've been trying to find this information in the repo, and I haven't been able to find it. But I've seen the Cluster API alpha feature list. But do we have anywhere on the repo that talks about the schedule? What is the target for the alpha release? So because I'm coming into this later than most of you guys, I don't know that information.
Yeah, so we've sort of talked about this verbally a couple of times. If you search through the meeting notes, you might find something. I think what I'd mentioned is my goal is to have something sort of around the end of this release cycle. So that if you look at just the Kubernetes cadence, it's every 3 months our new release gets cut. And we don't need to be tightly tied to exactly the day and date when they cut that release, but sort of around the same time, it would be really nice to have an alpha. There's a lot of sort of marketing material and blog posts and so forth that goes out around then. And if we can piggyback on that and say, and here's a new tool for cluster management you can use, it's an alpha, yada, yada, here are the links, that would be a really nice sort of wave to ride. That's going to depend a lot. There is that milestone. We need to make sure that the milestone is sort of up to date with the issues that we think are actually going to block us from saying that we have an alpha release, and then burn those down, right? So a lot of whether or not we can make that proposed schedule is based on whether we can get all of the issues fixed up.
Okay.
That being said, it's a community-based project, so if you want to pitch in and help make it go faster, please go ahead and take the issues. And on Tuesday next week or the week after, we will discuss how you can, assign yourself and get involved.
Cool. Anything else people want to add at the end? Going once, going twice. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. Just a reminder that there are all of the sort of various breakout meetings. I think most of them are earlier in the week than this meeting. So if you're interested in going to those, you can catch them at the beginning of next week. And otherwise, I will not be here next week. Chris is going to run the meeting. I've got another meeting I have to be at. So I will see folks in 2 weeks. Take care.